Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Inclusive Blog powered by RECONOMY. In this episode, we are talking about something that is often misunderstood in the business world: gender equality and inclusion. For many people, these topics are still framed primarily as social responsibility or moral obligation. But increasingly, evidence shows that inclusive businesses are actually more competitive, more resilient, and more innovative. So the question we want to explore in this episode is simple. Does inclusion actually pay off for businesses? To unpack this, I'm very pleased to be joined by two fantastic guests. First, Krueger, a global thought leader on gender equality, disability and social inclusion, and women's economic empowerment. And joining us as well is Nataliia Koshovska, my colleague, gender equality and social inclusion advisor at RECONOMY, implemented by Helvetas and funded by Sweden. Thank you both for joining. When people hear gender equality and inclusion, many still think of it as a social or moral agenda. Why should businesses actually care? If I can start with you, Holly.
Well, I think it's a good question, but for me, really, the evidence is clear. More gender diverse companies perform better.
And thank you. Nataliia?
Yeah, I think inclusion is not just nice to have, as sometimes it's considered so, but it's a smart business. Like when companies tap into the talent pool, they innovate faster, understand customers better. And that's why it's also important to have a diverse board representation, because if you half of the market is women and all the decisions are made by the men on the board, then yeah, you're operating with one eye closed, and it's better to have both eyes opened.
Really like that, one eye closed.
Thank you, Nataliia. And Holly, from your global experience, what's the strongest evidence you've seen that inclusion improves business performance, whether that's growth, resilience, or competitiveness?
Yeah, as I said, the data makes just really a compelling case. Diverse companies are 39% more likely to outperform competitors, generate 19% more revenue, and make 87% better decisions. And this isn't soft research this data points are coming from. This is from McKinsey, BCG, Harvard Business Schools, the people who are producing leaders and advising some of leaders from the top Fortune 500 companies. But for me, it's more than just the research. I've been advising businesses and organizations and running my own business for 20 years, and I've seen this play out on the ground. Diverse teams adapt faster, capture new markets at nearly double the rate, and retain the talent that drives growth. And companies that ignore this aren't just leaving opportunity on the table. They're 66% less likely to compete at the top. So for me, diversity isn't a values exercise. It's how you build businesses that grow, endure. It's exactly how I run my own business, which is comprised of diverse professionals.
Exactly. Thank you, Holly. And Nataliia, at RECONOMY, we work directly with market actors, right? With a range of market actors. What convinces businesses more? Is it data, peer examples, or seeing results themselves?
Oh, Sabin, I believe it's all three that matter because it's indeed very influential, but the real change happens when they see these results with their own eyes. For example, we work with educational facilities that never ran targeted campaigns for women because they believe that we treat everyone equally, so whoever comes, comes. But after trying a very simple female-focused enrollment campaigns with using gender-inclusive language, with women role models invited, with flexible schedules offered, and the overall message that breaks these job stereotypes, they suddenly saw more students come in and enrolling and higher revenue for themselves. So that's when inclusion stopped being just a theory for them and became like rather a business strategy.
Yeah. And can you share one concrete example where inclusive practices led to measurable business benefits?
Yeah, like on top to the example that I gave, when the vocational schools, they By changing the overall approach to the enrollment campaign, they saw a notable increase in female applicants in energy efficiency sector, in transportation and logistics sector. But we also have similar impacts across other initiatives. For instance, several reskilling and upskilling projects with public employment services. It helped companies to bridge the labor gaps and respond to workforce shortages in the emerging sectors. I would also highlight the Transdinarica project in Western Balkans, where the company revised both its business strategy and communication campaign, intentionally targeting customer base that is including like 25% of female cyclists, and this was something that they didn't do prior, like in their original market approach.
Thank you, Nataliia. Wholly across different regions and sectors, what are the most common inclusion practices that succeed, and which ones fail despite good intentions?
Great question, Sabin. So in my experience, I've worked in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The approaches that work the best are the ones that make inclusion part of how decisions actually get made. Not as a separate initiative or not as a separate side project, but as core to how the business operates. And that starts with having different voices when strategy is being shaped. It means mentorship that has real sponsorship behind it. People who are not just being advanced, but actually supported to move into leadership roles. And it means leaders setting the tone themselves, because as we know, culture follows what leaders do much more than any policy. And I want to emphasize this point around leadership, because our own research at the Canopy Lab keeps pointing to the fact that committed leadership is the critical difference. And this is not about leaders who talk about inclusion when it's convenient, or particularly around International Women's Day, but leaders who show up and show that commitment in everyday decisions through who gets heard, who gets developed, and who gets the opportunities. And I want to be clear, this is not easy. It often requires leaders to sit with some of the discomfort and question some of the assumptions about how things actually get done. I think this resonates with the point that Nataliia was just making. And I saw this very clearly about 10 years ago. I was advising a ready-made garments factory in Egypt, and they were dealing with high employee turnover, especially among women workers. And it was affecting their productivity and global competitiveness. The company had already tried training programs, but those had not really moved the needle or solved the problem. When things began to change, it was when they realized that the issue was not skills or performance. The issue was the fact that the line management, those that were overseeing these women factory workers, was majority men. And the women didn't feel comfortable raising issues to their male managers. And so instead of actually the company understanding what was going wrong, these women would engage in what we call quiet quitting. So it was only when the company really began to tackle some of the root causes of their problems by understanding what their recruitment process was, what their promotion and retention policies, and intentionally creating pathways for women managers to emerge, that they started to put in place real solutions. And so this is really when they started to address the root cause of the problem. And you asked about when it succeeds, that's great, but we also need to recognize when that fails. And where organizations go wrong is what follows a familiar or typical pattern. This is really just engaging in superficial actions, one-off trainings that make you feel good for having done it, but not really actually delivering anything of substance, or even diversity targets without real accountability. The organizations that tend to do this well have one thing in common. They treat inclusion as an ongoing practice and core to their business success. They know it's not something you do once and tick off the list. It takes effort, reflection, and course correction. But it's those same organizations that tend to be more adaptive, more competitive, and more trusted in markets where they operate. And I think it's important to say that to businesses who are listening today, you're not going to get this 100% right from the start. And that's okay. What matters is committing to the journey, holding yourself accountable, being honest when something is not working, learning from it, and continuing to move forward.
Thank you very much, Holly, for this. a common pushback is inclusion costs too much. And I would like to hear now from Nataliia, how do you respond to that from a business lens?
I would say that exclusion would cost you even more. So yeah,
Exactly.
to ignore that. Losing talent, missing customers, and repeating the same recruitment cycle is far more expensive than adapting the workplace or rethinking your message for recruitment or brand promotion. So inclusion is often, yes, seen as an extra investment, but sometimes it's just a different picture or photo used in your advertisement, or offering some flexible shift, because exactly that's what women need, having this double burden of unpaid care work that they perform. So yeah, that unlocks a bigger return for the companies in the long run. And also I would like to highlight that in RECONOMY, we pilot projects aimed at increased employability of people with disabilities, with a primary focus on building the market relevant skills. And for example, in Armenia, we collaborated with the Job IM, a national-wide job searching platform. And they introduced a new filter for users who search jobs specifically, like for people with disabilities. And indeed, of course, it required technical adjustments from their side, but it also significantly strengthened their own market positioning and helped them to attract a broader and more loyal user space. So yeah, when it comes to recruitment of people with disabilities, what we often observe is that companies, employers, they're not aware of what is a reasonable accommodation. And sometimes, in most cases, this reasonable accommodation is coming with a zero cost or very minimal cost. And even those adjustments that they have to required to do, national legislation typically provides incentives or benefits to the employers who hire people with disabilities, but sometimes it's just the lack of knowledge from their side. And yeah, this is also something that we have to promote.
Thank you, Nataliia. And wholly in more conservative or traditional markets, how do you introduce inclusion without triggering this resistance or defensiveness from business leaders?
Great question. And I've worked in a lot of diverse markets. Lead with business language, not inclusion language. So when I walk into an office, talk to a business leader, and I've worked with many, it's not about convincing anyone of my values position. I'm there to talk about growth, competitiveness, and risk. Because as I shared at the top, the evidence is unambiguous. Companies with diverse leadership are 39% more likely to outperform competitors. They generate 19% more revenue, and they make better decisions, retain better talent, adapt faster to market shifts. This is not advocacy, that is real business data. So in the conversation I have with business leaders, it isn't that you should care about inclusion. It's that your competitors are already doing this, and here's what it's costing you. I think this is an important reframing, and I think this is what Nataliia was also kind of referencing. Is the cost. There's a higher cost to not factoring in inclusion in your work, and I think resistance, in my experience, really comes from when business leaders feel that you're challenging their culture or telling them that what they're doing is wrong. But when you start to come to them with ways in which they can optimize their business performance by addressing recruitment, retention, promotion practices, they start to understand this. That starts to ground it a bit more. And so when I tell business leaders, I tell them this directly. If you're not taking inclusion seriously, you're not taking your business seriously. That's not a moral argument. It's a competitive one. And in my experience, it's the argument that opens doors, regardless of the market, the sector, or the culture.
Thank you, Holly. And looking ahead 5 to 10 years, Holly, what risks do businesses face if they ignore inclusion, especially in terms of talent, innovation, access to markets? I think you've covered a little bit, but yeah, I would like to hear.
Sure. I think the answer kind of the question largely answers itself, but I want to point out something new or something different, because I think there's a risk here around resilience. The businesses that are going to succeed over the next decade are the ones that can adapt. And we know from evidence from research that homogenous organizations, homogenous businesses are usually less well set up to do this. But going to your questions around talent, on talent, the workforce is changing. Whether businesses are ready for it or not, it's becoming more diverse. And younger generations, and I'm seeing this in my own business, are paying closer attention to inclusion when they choose where to work. So the competition for talent is increasing, and it's only going to get fiercer. And if organizations ignore inclusion, they're going to be limiting themselves to a really small pool of talent. On the question of innovation, we have strong evidence that diverse teams make better decisions and are better at problem solving. And those are not just nice to have when it comes to business operations. That's real business advantage, and it builds over time. And if you're drawing from the same perspectives again and again, you are likely to miss what others are seeing. And that's something, again, as I see in my own consulting firm, the value of diverse perspectives, particularly when it comes to framing problems and identifying possible solutions. Our markets, consumer demographics are shifting globally. We know that. It becomes much harder to reach new customer segments, build trust, and really understand emerging markets if your organization doesn't reflect the people you're trying to serve. As I said at the top, underneath all of this is really about resilience. What I've seen in my 20 years of experience working across Africa, Middle East, and Asia, the organizations and businesses that I've seen handle disruption best are the ones with diverse leadership. They have different perspectives on that help them challenge assumptions, spot risk earlier, and respond faster when conditions change. So put simply, if you ignore inclusion now, you're leaving growth on the table.
Thank you, Holly. Nataliia, what risks do businesses face if they ignore inclusion?
Yeah, I really like what Hello said about the business leadership, and that inclusion is not like a charity, it's a competitive advantage, and they have to consider to stay relevant to the market, because indeed this new generation of young customers and workers, they try to align it with values they have, their career choice or customer choice. And if a company has no inclusion policy, doesn't have commitment to do no harm, either it's like to humans or to the planet, and doesn't have inclusive supply chain, then young people may just scroll past them. This is an attention economy we're living in. So yeah, let's follow the new rules, and they are really good rules to focus on companies that act responsibly, not only just profitably. So yeah, I would say that staying exclusive is a risky business strategy.
Thank you very much to both of you for this really interesting conversation. What stands out for this episode's conversation is that inclusion is not just the right thing to do, it is increasingly a smart business strategy. And companies that embrace diverse talent, inclusive workplaces, and equitable opportunities are often better positioned to innovate, adapt, and grow. And that's something businesses everywhere are starting to recognize. Thank you once again, Nataliia and Holly, for sharing your insights. Until next time.